like Twitter existed, Facebook existed. But, and, you know, they're both used to disseminate information and also misinformation, which we can talk about more later. But it was still like somewhat new. I think, you know, it was only a couple years earlier, Obama's speech on race got more views on his YouTube than on all of the like mainstream media combined, and just sort of that sent a shockwave through a lot of activist media. I think we all saw that there was this potential to like control the narrative and to combat a like corporate industry controlled media landscape. And that was coming right on the heels of like DFA sort of revolutionizing online organizing. And so blogging at that point was at a point of like being accepted. We were no longer just like pajamas, you know, or wearing our pajamas sitting in the basement. You know, we had like the House Rules Committee like reaching out to us to make sure that we had a blogger there in the press pool to watch them send the most historic legislation in decades to the House of the floor, or the floor of the House. So I tried to use this opportunity to like amplify a lot of voices like Laura's, people that were experiencing stuff she experienced only before we had the ACA to protect them. So people that had pre-existing conditions, who were being denied care, who were going bankrupt, who had lost loved ones. And so it was just emotionally, it was a pretty difficult thing to do, to just like constantly be hearing all these terrible stories of what our healthcare system was like. And it's really important to remember these people, because for a lot of them, the ACA really did change things. And I'm a single payer advocate, so I obviously think it didn't go nearly far enough. But when we look back on it, it really was such a big deal. And I remember leaving the Rules Committee at like midnight, right after they sent the final reconciliation package down. And I was like standing in entirely by myself in the rotunda at one point, and just feeling like the weight of what had just happened. And it was a big moment. It's kind of crazy to think it's 12 years ago now.
Yeah, I'm having a combination of gratitude and FOMO. That's kind of amazing. And I'm so glad you're bringing up the media, Will, because, you know, first of all, again, I am so glad you two are the first people joining me on this show, because it's just like, I know that you two in this conversation are going to take this conversation where it needs to go. And the media aspect, you both are people whose activism and contributions have been shaped by digital media in a way that I wouldn't have thought of till we're having this conversation. And me too, absolutely. Because instead of this, I frequently feel like we're being gaslit by the media model in this country, because it's like, okay, we're going to talk about the things that very rich people care about. And occasionally those will coincide with everyone else cares about, which is great. I love it when that happens. I think we all do want justice for Ukraine. Absolutely. But there are so many other stories that need to be told. And Will, what you're talking about, like hearing people's healthcare horror stories, we've been there. All of us. Laura with Care Talk and everything else you do. Will, I think like the first time that I really felt that heaviness was with the Kavanaugh fight, where we were having women come to us and like sharing into our microphone for the very first time their assault stories, and the openness that the internet has given people to lift up the stories that are relatable, that overwhelming majorities experience every day, and yet somehow is not what gets covered in places like the New York Times and the Washington Post. And nowhere is that more true than the healthcare fight. Because Laura, I love that you bring this up all the time on Care Talk, a healthcare injustice doesn't have to be a horror story for it to be completely unfair. Like maybe you don't have some crazy 6-figure bill that you've been handed, but we've all probably been given a bill for $300 that should have been free. I mean, Laura, how did you come to that? Did you always have that sensibility, or was it being in this fight that sort of made you realize like, okay, this is completely unequal and unfair?
Well, I've always been an agitator, you could say. I remember I think it was in middle school, there was a teacher that was terrible that we agitated against. And then in high school, a substitute teacher was fired that we tried to get to come back. So that's always been my personality. But I think it's a really interesting point about how the media has changed, because 12 years ago, I was working with the media trying to amplify people's healthcare stories in the state of Arkansas. And so there was an AP reporter, a Reuters reporter, the local paper that was covered statewide, and then there were city papers that we would talk to. And so a lot of my job was trying to get a hold of these few reporters that controlled the flow of information in Arkansas, and also trying to get TV cameras to come out to our pop-up press events and so on. I took videos at the time and uploaded them to YouTube, and 12 years later, they might still be out there on the internet somewhere. But, the people that saw those videos were like 10 views. So how we got people's stories out was through the traditional media. And if the traditional media didn't show up, then you were out of luck. But now, I mean, I tweeted about my story this morning, and I think the last time I checked, hundreds of thousands of people have seen my story today that I posted myself, not intermediated through anybody else, just tens of thousands of likes and retweets later. I can reach a much more sizable audience, and there isn't a gatekeeper, so people can tell their own stories and can get beyond how the traditional media would decide whether something was worth covering, or whether to share your story or not. Now you can go around them, and for good or bad, social media is not all good. There's plenty of
Yes.
misinformation that gets out there too. But it's an avenue to tell your story and to make change. We never would have succeeded in stopping the repeal efforts in 2017 if it wasn't people's personal stories and breaking out beyond maybe what the traditional media wanted to cover.
Yeah, and as you talk, the way, like, if you have to win over the prestige press, I imagine the way you tell that story has to change by definition. When, you know, it's like you're saying, I mean, we can just have our personal Twitter, TikTok, Facebook, whatever, and get 3,000 people to hear what we're saying. That's obvious. You're right. Obviously, there are downsides. Maybe the downsides outweigh the positives. But I think the healthcare fight, like, did you all, when you were covering this so closely and organizing this so closely, did you ever foresee Medicare for all and single payer becoming central to the conversation in the way it is now?
Yes. I've always thought we would eventually be heading in that way. I think, I have some qualms with the way they did the mandate. I think it was a little backwards, and the government should be the one mandated to make sure we're all covered. And that, if there's going to be any fee, it should be them paying us when they fail to get us covered. But I do think it was really important that our government, for the first time, like, put it on paper that they think every single person should have health care, not just old people, not just young people, not just very poor people, but every single person in this country should be covered. And if we get there one day with something like Medicare for all or a single payer system, I think we're going to look back on Obamacare as being a big part of what made that happen.
Well, I love that you say that because, and again, another thing that Laura, you talk about a lot is it's really easy to get, I mean, how could you not get discouraged? People are literally dying from these policy failures. So I never want to minimize anyone on the left who is pushing us to go further. But at the same time, that's also not really how policy change happens. It's not like, oh, wait, we should do this other thing? Yeah, man, definitely. Let's do that other thing. No, it doesn't work like that. It's gradually increasing, escalating fights until people in cultural power do win out over bad policy and charlatan corporatism. Because this isn't a fringy thing. Every single person in America is going to live long enough to have a health concern. And if they don't, that's a worse issue. But like, people need healthcare. And again, you guys, this is a Laura recommendation. TD reads, it's the, what is it? The healing.
TR, The Healing of America.
I love how I'm like vociferously recommending this book when I always forget the name, but it's so great. He was a military doctor and he travels all over the world. Trigger warning, it will make you angry because you're like, WTF, literally every developed country has a better healthcare system than ours. Like, it's wild. It's wild. Did it shock you when you first read that, or did you sort of already know going in that's what you were going to get?
Well, as a kid, I grew up in California, England, and Hong Kong. So I'd already lived under different healthcare systems. When I broke my arm in Hong Kong, I don't think we got billed at all. So, I already knew that other countries did this much better than we do. But I think a lot of people in America aren't aware that there is a better way.
Yeah, I didn't. I grew up, my mom is a doctor. Now my sister is a doctor as well, but I like the thought of not being able to see a doctor was very foreign to me. And it was one of the things that radicalized me when I started learning about things like a kid in Maryland who got a tooth infection that his family couldn't afford to fix. And by the time it was bad enough that they could take him to an emergency room, it spread to his brain and he died. And we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to save a kid because as a country, we were too cheap to just spend $80 to save him earlier and with a lot less pain and suffering. So for me, when I learned that, that was what a lot of what radicalized me and made me want to start working on this issue.
Well, and I love that you bring that up, Will, because I think, understandably, when we have these conversations, it's a lot about how much things cost and how egregious it's like, okay, so implied in that is if people can't pay for things, they simply don't live. They don't get that care. And it's deeply shocking to live in a country where that is normalized. I mean, so I'm talking to two people who have been professionally and personally engaged in this fight for 11, 12 years. How have you all seen that level of rage escalate, or has it just been sort of a simmer as people get more and more informed?
Well, I think a lot of people live paycheck to paycheck. And I think when you are juggling multiple shift jobs, it's hard to see outside of your situation very much. You can be sort of mad at the world or mad at the system, but you don't have the time to contemplate what went wrong or how the whole system is broken because you are in the system. You are just trying to get by. So I think that a lot of people are mad because incomes in America have been flat pretty much for the past few decades. So more and more it takes two people in a household to make the math work. And people don't have the luxury of the time to consider what systemic is broken.
Well, I love that you bring that up. It's something that Bernie brought up, and Will and I got to cover Bernie's announcement tour. Still one of our most fun friend trips, I think.
This is also the anniversary of the last event I got to work on that tour.
Oh, really?
3 years ago today, yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's sort of bittersweet and sad. I love that he brought that up a lot in his speeches. And that's, again, the reason I wanted to have this show. We don't talk enough about the fact that, like, what does it say about our country where a bunch of people can't get divorced because they're reliant on their partner's health care, because if we have a system where people are getting their care through their job or their spouse, that means a lot of people can't leave abusive relationships. And that's a very uncomfortable thing that people don't want to talk about. But all these weird positive psychology memes on the internet, like, girl, you deserve better. Oh, really? Is it that simple? If you leave and you and potentially your children don't have health care, yeah, you might just suck it up and deal with it. In a single payer system that doesn't exist because you have health care through the government and it's not free because we pay for it with our taxes. Do you two see that understanding of that changing? Or do you, because from what I'm seeing, the public is all on board with the government being involved in the distribution of healthcare because the government's already involved. They're just involved poorly.
Well, I'm going to be a little bit cynical here and say that even though a majority of Americans believe in reproductive choices for everybody, that women shouldn't be forced to bear a child, that a vast majority of Americans believe that kids shouldn't be shot up in schools, that people shouldn't be running around with assault rifles. And yet the way that our system is structured, the way that the powers control Congress, there's this deadlock, and they haven't been able to get anything done on this. And part of that is the 60 vote majority in the Senate. You need to have a super majority to get anything passed, which means nothing even remotely controversial. And by controversial, I mean that people with a lot of money dislike it because, again, majority of Americans support, ending the gun violence. But when a lot of people with a lot of power and money come out against these things, like lowering the cost of prescription drugs, like making healthcare more affordable, it gets a lot harder in our current system of government.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to look at a government that can't even raise the minimum wage after so long and not have some skepticism about what we're going to be able to get done. I am emboldened by the fact that it just a handful of years ago, well, it's probably more like 6 years ago now, Medicare for all was seen of as sort of like a joke, like a pipe dream. And now, in our last presidential election, it was one of the top issues. So I'm hopeful. I always believe that we can get to some change. I do think that Laura's exactly right when she says there's some real systemic problems getting in our way, and that includes the filibuster, and that includes redistricting. It takes a lot for Democrats to win the House. We have to win the popular vote on the House by a lot to actually win enough seats to hold power. So yeah, I'm skeptical, but I like to keep a little bit of hope.
Well, and that's a thing, right? I mean, how could you not be? It's why I love, plug for Care Talk. That's why I love Laura's show, Care Talk, because I should have put a chyron up with the phone number. You people should all tweet at Laura your healthcare questions, because we can't just be like, okay, until we get Medicare for all, we do nothing. And that's where I actually get frustrated. And I'm so glad you both are here, because a lot of people, when they're like, the ACA didn't go far enough. Yes, that's very true. But a lot of lives were saved. I read a number this morning that communities of color insured rate has risen 40% since the Affordable Care Act. Like, we are making progress, and it's easy to, when it comes to the things we want, right? I want France's healthcare system. You just show up, be French, and you get healthcare. That's awesome. I want to show up, be American, and just get healthcare. That would be great. But a lot of that is cultural too, right? One of the things about the French people, anything changes and they riot. They're like, oh, you're charging us $3 instead of $2? We're flooding the streets. Like, that's what I want to see in America.
And to bring it back to Bernie Sanders, in 2017, when the Republicans came after Obamacare, he delayed his Medicare for all bill so that he could go rally people around Obamacare. And I actually got to go with him to Kentucky and West Virginia, deep red territory, where he filled rooms to say save Obamacare, because it absolutely is important. I consider myself a huge single payer advocate, and I put myself on the line with like the ADAPT protesters and everyone getting arrested there, to like film them getting arrested and fighting back against this, because it really is important. It helped a lot of people, and it's perfectly fine to say it didn't go far enough and to say we should go farther, but getting rid of it is not how we're going to get there.
And your point, Jocelyn, in that it's not a perfect system, but it is saving lives. And if we were to produce something better, like, first of all, I don't see a path today to getting those votes unless we, radically restructure our government. So I don't see a path to something dramatically better. But also, even if there was, there would be several years lead time before it was implemented. And people's lives are at risk today. So I believe in saving the people that we can save right now.
I really love that. And both of you. I mean, Will, I didn't know that Bernie did that. When was this?
That was in 2017. It was
Okay.
so when when the Republicans were trying to repeal it, and of course we had that moment with John McCain. If if only more politicians could think about what the health consequences were for people. And I imagine John McCain's health scare had something to do with his vote there, because he saw it firsthand and he saw what it meant to have people take care of you when you're sick.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that is the enigma of the American healthcare system. We have such potential. We provide the rest of the world with the wealth created not just by money, but by we have some of the most sophisticated medical institutions in the world. We have an abundance of research and pharmaceutical resources at our fingertips. And it's when you hear criticisms of more public options for people, it's, oh, but we're America, we're amazing, and that's built off private industry. No, it's not. It's all, most of it's government funded already. The people that are reaping the benefits of that is just not the people. And do you find that people understand that when you two are speaking about it?
Well, I think that, most people don't live and breathe this healthcare policy stuff because they're out having their lives. But I think a lot of people don't realize that so much of what pharmaceutical companies, for example, so much of their research is based on taxpayer research that we already paid for. So we put up the money and then they collect the profits. So there's a lot of things in medicine that are like that people that are profiting off of work that they didn't do, and we're all paying for it. So I think that's something that not a lot of people are necessarily aware of. And I think, most people assume that their congressperson is good and throw the rest of the bums out. So I think people assume that their local hospital is good. Maybe their insurance company is good, or if they've ever actually used it. But they don't necessarily realize how some nominally nonprofit hospitals have incredible profit margins, that they aren't building all these beautiful buildings and paying their administrators multiple millions of dollars out of the goodness of their nonprofit hearts. So there's a lot of pieces in the healthcare system that are driven by profit, even if they are supposedly nonprofit. And then as American taxpayers, we're just footing the bill for all of it.
Yeah. And when we talk about profit, I think actually one of the better things Obamacare did was limiting insurance companies to 15%, to spending 15% of their money on administrative costs. Before this, they spent about 33% or so. And Medicare, Medicaid, they spend on average like 2 to 3 and are capped at 5%. And this is why the healthcare companies didn't want a public option, because they didn't want to compete with that. But I'll never forget the first time I got a letter in the mail, and my employer was paying for my full healthcare at the time. But I got a letter from my insurance company that told me they didn't spend enough of their money on healthcare. They spent too much as a percentage on administrative costs, so they were reimbursing my employer part of our healthcare costs. That was a really important thing Obamacare did. It's absolutely obscene how much these companies were spending on administrative costs. And frankly, we should cap it more. We should keep going. But it was a very good start. And it was good to say, like, hey, you have to spend a certain amount on healthcare. Like, this is what you say your role is to provide healthcare. You have to actually provide it.
Well, and it's we don't realize, like, when health insurance companies actually pay for our healthcare, it's considered a profit loss.
Yeah.
Like, maybe you're not comfortable with the word anti-capitalist, and I get that. That's fine. But think about how wild it is that allegedly the whole purpose of insurance is we give them some money and then they give us healthcare when they're sick, and that they do not actually view their job to pay for our care. They view their job to exploit us for whatever it is we're paying. And, when you talk about having children, the number gets even higher. And not just for like the literally having kids, but kids have all this weird stuff, and then parents feeling vulnerable and anxious are like, sure, take my money. And it's like you just wonder, does it say about our country that the most lucrative industries out there, whether it's finance, pharmaceuticals, administrative positions at these companies, are the not only jobs that don't do anything? Because you know what? If you want to not do anything and get paid a lot, good for you. Like, get the bag. But actually getting paid to go after people in ways that result in either just like slaughtering people's assets or actual loss of life. I mean, it kind of makes me sick to my stomach when you think about that. But
Yeah, I mean, when it comes down to it, like the free market and public health just don't work together. I think the free market is great at giving us a good TV, but when it comes to protecting sick people, it's the exact wrong incentives. They are incentivized to deny care as much as possible. And frankly, these companies have been run completely ruthlessly. They were giving out bonuses for denying people care. And the fact is, the term pre-existing condition should never exist. It's just someone with a health problem. But if they said we don't want to cover someone with a health problem, that would sound too obviously like the opposite of what their company should exist for. And people would want to tear those companies down and replace it with something better.
And also, for as bad as our current healthcare system is, it's important to consider that hedge funds and venture capital firms are buying up pieces of the medical system like mad. They're buying up small doctors' practices and so on. And so they are specifically out for a profit. So if they buy up your doctor's practice, it's not going to be to lower your costs. It's going to be to jack up costs so they make profits for their investors. So the more that our healthcare system is bought by vulture capitalists, the more that we're all going to suffer.
Well, and I love that you bring that up, Laura, because it's, I really don't like how we talk about healthcare, like actual practitioners, like doctors in this country, because it's becoming increasingly inaccurate. Will's mom's a doctor, my mom's a doctor. And like I'm sure there was a period where being a doctor was a sweet deal. It's not anymore. You're going wildly into debt. You have egregious legal fees. You're constantly, I was literally talking to my mom last night about like, being a female professional and all the stress it caught. And it's so sad because it's like nobody really goes into healthcare at that level anyway, to be a nurse or a doctor or a PA. You do that because you want to help people and take care of people. And it's deeply sad that what people are constantly presented with is like, okay, either sell out, work for one of these jackal capitalist companies, or continue to provide care, but just be under constant duress from all directions.
Not to mention having to work throughout a pandemic and keep going to the office. Yeah.
Right. Literally risking your life. And the burnout is crazy. And because of the student loan crisis in our company, it's not even like people can be like, you know what, I'm over this. No, because unless you're from a wealthy family, you may have gone like $200,000 into debt to become a physician. That's lowballing it.
Mm-hmm. It's a new version of indentured servitude. People can't quit doing what they're doing because they will never pay off $300,000 worth of med school debt otherwise.
Right. Exactly. And I mean, it's again why solidarity, like I totally understand why there's tension between more privileged members of the middle class versus working class. And I think those are important tensions to talk about. But at the end of the day, if you can't afford to quit your job and still have health care and a house and feed your family, we all have way more in common together than we do with Jeff Bezos or any of these other people who make millions of dollars in a day, more than most of us will ever see in our entire lifetime.
Yeah, and I think, especially before Obamacare, healthcare emergency was the leading cause of bankruptcy in this country, and you could have done everything right and just driving home, get in a bad car accident, and you lose your house and you lose your savings. So when you say you're much closer to the poorest people in our country than you are to Jeff Bezos, it's absolutely true. And so we really do have to have solidarity and say that, like, the idea of like a middle class and a lower class is kind of like an absurd way of thinking of things, because someone who seems middle class can be sent down to lower class like that. And it's not nearly that easy to go the other way.
It's so true. I promise it's related. I was literally just talking to Connor, my fiance, about this when we were working in restaurants when we were much younger. I used to see people in like business suits and be like, oh man, those are like professional rich people. And like then, I turned 26 and you get your first professional job and you're like, oh, like, a bunch of those people probably didn't make any more money than me, maybe less, like maybe also didn't have health care. And that is the big lie that I think the healthcare fight reveals. If even the wealthiest people in this country can't be confident that their healthcare will take care of them when they're sick, if even the wealthiest people in this country can't be confident in housing and education for their children, then we have to have a very serious conversation about what's happening at a systemic level, because it's so seductive to be like, oh yes, the middle class versus the working class, but it increasingly doesn't work like that anymore.
And I think a lot of people don't necessarily know just how expensive healthcare is. I am so grateful I had the Affordable Care Act health insurance, because I was diagnosed and treated in 2017. If it had been prior to 2014, when I had junk insurance, at some point insurance would have tapped out and said, we're done paying, you're on your own. Or they would have done something called rescission, where they would have gone back through my healthcare application and pointed out that I didn't list I had acne in high school or whatever. And they would find a reason to get rid of me. And the reason why they do that is because it's so expensive. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars to save my life. I had 2 hospitalizations, and each hospitalization was about $100,000, plus chemotherapy and the drugs to get over chemotherapy every 2 weeks for 6 months and a month of radiation. It was over $500,000 to save my life. And hardly anybody, middle class, working class, or even rich people, just happens to be sitting on $1 million in their bank account to pay for if something really bad happens to them.
Well, and I love that you say it like that, Laura, because it's, think about what we are promoting and allowing in this country, that they literally can send you a bill and say, hey, we know you're dealing with this life-threatening complication that we allegedly are here to protect you from. Sorry, too expensive. Have a lovely day. It's literally an execution unless unless you are, as Laura is, scrappy and resourceful and figured it out. But you shouldn't have to figure it out. And I'm really uncomfortable with the spirit of like hustle, entrepreneurism, like, outfox the system. I'm sorry, we shouldn't have a system, because it's not the healthcare itself. It's not the chemotherapy drugs. That is not what's costing all that money. It's the salaries for CEOs and administrative people and pharmaceutical reps who are making egregious salaries off of our suffering.
Yeah, and there's no better example of that than insulin. Like, the way prices have gone up for insulin is frankly evil, and people should probably go to jail for it in a just society. But really, our industry is just focused on profit, and they will do whatever they can to squeeze every cent they can out of people. And like I said, insulin is just a perfect example of how terrible the incentives are in this system. And it's one of the places where Obamacare just hasn't succeeded in as far as eliminating these blood sucking for profit people from the system. We still have further to go on that.
Well, and as I absolutely knew would happen, I can't believe we only have 15 minutes left. Just why I was like, should I do 30 minutes? No, this will be an hour conversation. So this is entirely on me, but I want to make sure that, again, I have these experts here. So Affordable Care Act passes. And then where are we now and where are we going? I know that is a huge question that could probably fill a 500-page book, but Laura, what do you think?
Okay, well, the Affordable Care Act was signed into law 12 years ago, 2010. And then it kind of went into, there wasn't a lot of change back then because the idea was to, get something passed and then build on it. But that fall of 2010, Republicans took over the House. This was the Tea Party movement and so on. So there no longer were the votes to pass anything in Congress that would make it better. So there were things right away that needed to be fixed, and there are things later. So there has been no substantial change to the Affordable Care Act in a decade. The first big change happened last year after Biden took office and the House and the Senate were controlled by at least nominally Democrats. They passed the American Rescue Plan. And what the American Rescue Plan did was it made Affordable Care Act insurance policies much cheaper for people that made a little bit too much money to get financial help before. Now they would qualify. And so nobody would pay more than 8.5% of their income for health insurance. But the catch was that these subsidies end at the end of this year. So if nothing is done, insurance policy costs are gonna grow much higher for next year. And that's going to come out around October, the new rates. So understandably, I would think that the politicians in Congress will realize that it is a benefit to them to do something about this. But at least for the moment, the Affordable Care Act plans face this cliff at the end of the year. So that's one thing that people are working on in solving that, in continuing to make insurance plans cheaper. Another thing is making drug costs cheaper. When Medicare Part D was signed into law under W, they specifically disallowed the government from negotiating cheaper drug prices through Medicare, not using their own bargaining power to strike a better deal for American taxpayers. That was a giant giveaway to Big Pharma. But it's in maybe process fixing that. So saving money for American taxpayers by getting us a better deal on prescription drug costs and also lowering the cost of prescription drugs. And there are various mechanisms in place to make that filter out to people that don't have Medicare, including capping insulin costs, the copays at $35 for people with insurance. So that is still a big gap for people without insurance that face list price of insulin. So those are two pieces that's being talked about. A third piece is expanding Medicaid in the states that refuse to expand Medicaid so far. So Florida, Georgia, Texas, North Carolina, Wisconsin. These states refuse to take the free money from the government to expand healthcare to working class citizens in their states. So you face a situation where if you make less than a certain amount of money, you don't get subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, but you can't get Medicaid. So this means that working class families that make very little can't get health care at all, that they're priced out. And that's because these conservative legislators in these states refuse to do anything that might be considered as helping Obama, even though that's a fight that's a decade old now. And so in many states, they have used the ballot initiative process to pass it. So states like Nebraska and Oklahoma and Missouri have finally expanded healthcare to their working class citizens over the objections of their own state legislators. And that's because the people of these states believe that everyone should have healthcare. And it's only these conservative Republicans that are standing in the way of that. So there is supposedly a federal fix to this problem. So over 2 million people in places like Florida and Texas and Georgia will finally get healthcare. So those are 3 pieces being talked about. We'll know more after they get back from recess at the end of April. I think right now Congress is working on getting a new Supreme Court justice. They got through the budget process. And I think that this particular fight, the budget reconciliation fight, will happen soon in the next month or so. But again, it's going to all come up to the people like Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema, because they need 50 votes.
Yep. And I think everything Laura just said there was great. I don't even think I have anything to add about the ACA. But what I will say is Bernie Sanders is re-releasing his Medicare for All bill soon. Jayapal's House version of it has more co-sponsors right now than ever before. And Laura is right that that's a longer term fight. We aren't going to pass that this year, but if that's something you're interested in, that it's going to be getting released soon. And there's a number of initiatives in states to expand Medicare and things like that.
Yeah, that was you just both provided like a standalone education. We'll just like clip that out. Be like, do you want to understand the history of healthcare in modern America? Here you go. So thank you very much for that. On a slightly more personal note, we have a few minutes left. Like, when you both look back on all this, how are you feeling? And because you both are in it, you're like, again, watch Care Talk, 4:30 p.m. on act.tv. How are you feeling about how far we've come and how far there is to go?
It's as I think with everything in politics, it's always a pretty big mixed bag. If you really care about the world, like this world has so much injustice, it's hard to be anything more than a little like down. But I think passing that was a huge moment, and we forget that we can do big things. We can pass big legislation. We just have to really, really fight for it. And we always have to be prepared for the other side to throw a fight at us. If you remember the disinformation around Obamacare, death panels saying it funded abortion, all this just nonsense that was so easily refutable, that was obviously lies. That doesn't feel that dissimilar from like the misinformation campaigns that Trump runs today. He just maybe put it a little bit on steroids, but that was always the sort of standard operating procedure of the GOP, to just throw whatever lies they could think of at the wall and see what sticks. So I just want people to just constantly prepare yourself for that our other side is fighting very hard and will use basically any tactic. So just always be prepared for that.
Laura, how about you?
Well, I think that the real death panels were from the insurance companies. If you go back to before the Affordable Care Act, insurance companies would decide whether you lived or whether you died. And that was all about making larger profits for their shareholders. So now we live in a world in which there are some regulations on insurance companies. It's not a perfect world. There's a lot to do to make healthcare more affordable and make sure everyone can get it. But we at least live in a world where I could get diagnosed and then I faced a maximum out of pocket of a few $1,000s, as opposed to the over $500,000 it cost to cure me. So we're making progress. I think that we need to make sure that our legislators keep hearing from us that they do not get to take a vacation and not finish the job. There are things they can do right now to make healthcare more affordable in America. And these are bills that there's probably the votes to make it happen if they bring it all together, as opposed to future things that are quite far away. There are things they could be doing right now, and they need to do right now, because we need to make sure that as many people as possible are still here next year.
Those are my 2 tweets from this show. Well, we can do big things. And Laura, the actual death panels are the insurance companies, because totally agree on both of those. And, again, like, thank you to both of you for all that you do. I know it's not easy. I think a lot of times, maybe people who aren't, for whatever reason, like maybe they don't have the privilege of being as involved or whatever, don't understand, like, the people in this fight aren't like, I don't know, disembodied activist types with no thoughts and feelings. They're actual human beings who sacrifice. I know you both have interests outside of this work, and I really do appreciate how much of yourself you've put into something that is incredibly draining. Like, it's like you're saying, Will, it's hard to like be even a little bit educated about these things and be filled with happiness and joy. Like, oh, good, 45,000 people die a year because of this horrendous system. But to stay engaged is an act of bravery, I think. I mean, how
Yeah,
do you
and to keep your mind focused on like the good things we have done, like Obamacare reduced the uninsured by about a third. So if we think of like people being stuck on the other side of a river that we're trying to get here, we got a third of them here, and we still have more to do to get the rest. But it's important to like be happy that we got a third of the people here, and that a lot of those people were the people that needed it the most, people that had pre-existing conditions. In other words, people that like need healthcare. Like that's good, and we should remember that. As bad as the world may seem sometimes, we can still get some good things done.
Absolutely. Where would you drive people now? Like, if people were going to come to you guys and be like, okay, so I want to get involved, what should I do? Watch Care Talk, watch Act TV.
Yes, you should watch Care Talk, 4:30 Eastern on Mondays on Act TV. But if you have a specific medical condition, find out if there is a group or foundation organizing around that condition. That's a good entry level place to start. They won't get very political, but they will do some things. So if you have cancer, look for American Cancer Society. Look for a foundation that covers your specific type of cancer. Also, I am the executive director of Healthcare Voter. Feel free to follow us on social media, get involved. And Protect Our Care is another organization that is doing a lot to expand healthcare in America. Also, if you are interested in telling your own story, I founded a nonprofit called Healthcare Voices. If you go to healthcarevoices.org, we have resources there for storytellers to help you tell your story more effectively and make change.
Yeah, and I like telling your story is just so important. Like for most of us, we may not be healthcare experts or policy experts, but you're absolutely an expert of your story. And so many of us have a story about this healthcare system and how it failed us or how it helped us and how we can do more of that. So those stories are just so important.
Well, thank you both for an amazing first show. This is this is more than what I wanted it to be, because again, like I mean, you're both friends of mine. Like I feel quite strongly that like it's a mistake when we make these policy discussions impersonal, because they're arguably the most personal thing, right? Like this isn't discrete math. These are human lives. And, there are very few fights at this point, whether it's gun violence, the climate crisis, healthcare, that isn't going to affect all of us. And they love siloing us. They love being like, oh, this is an issue for the very poor's or the women's. It's like, no, I mean, even if you aren't a woman, you're probably like dating one or know a couple. Like these are all very like, and I mean, it's really scary to think about that a lot of the things that stress us out on a daily basis are not actual personal failings, they're policy failings. Like if you can't afford to pay your bills and you work 40 hours a week, that's a failure of policy, probably not a failure of you being greedy enough to want food. Yeah, we're at time. I apologize.
Yeah, that's a great place to end it, though. And I just want to say congratulations on your show, and I hope it's a great success.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Laura. Everybody, again, watch Care Talk at 4:30 p.m. on Mondays. And Will and I will be coming to you all from the Supreme Court tomorrow morning at what, 8 a.m.?
Well, you and Alex, I'll be back behind the camera where I'm most
You will
comfortable.
be with us. Yes, some illegal hour, like 8 a.m. or something. Anyways.
I'll bring coffee.
Yeah. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great Wednesday.